Thank you for the invitation to come and present this paper or this discussion. This discussion, as you understand, is about regulation. South Africa, as you probably are aware, has essentially become a regulated state or a regulatory state over the last 10 years. They've been putting into place two monolithic regulators to regulate the financial markets. It's a market conduct regulator and a prudential regulator. My original estimate of what this would cost would be 6 billion rand per annum. The National Treasury, as part of the process of taking this to Parliament, had to do an assessment, and their figures are slightly different. They estimated 4.8 to 6. So in the top end is where I got, and if you know anything about government estimates, they usually underestimate. So the 6 would be the bottom, not the top. In subsequent conversations, everybody goes to the 4.8. I stick to the 6 because that's where it's going to end up. That's not where we're there. Now, what we have to understand is that the last 10 years have been devoted to creating the infrastructure for these two regulators. The substantive rules for regulation, they are still to come. So, and they will come from each of these different regulators as we go along. Now, right from the very beginning, when this was suggested, I try to find the rationale. Why would we want to impose a cost of 6 billion rand per annum on the public? There has to be a good explanation. You're going to go to Parliament, you're going to have to say to Parliament, it's going to cost so much money, and we're going to do that. Now, the only justification that the government has ever been able to put forward was the global financial crisis. We had a global financial crisis, and as a result of that, we need to have this new regulatory system in place. And this new regulatory system is completely different to anything we've had. To use the words of National Treasury, it's invasive, intrusive, and draconian. So they want to get into the way everybody does operations, and they want to tell them how to run everything they're going to do. So that's the philosophy all along it. Now, right at the beginning, I could never find a connection between the global financial crisis and the South African regulation. You know, if that's your justification, that is fine, but let's look at it, and then I find that that is not there. And they've never been able to go beyond that. So in the last debate we had, I said clearly there is no connection. And not only that, the global financial crisis which we had did not impact on South Africa, and it's unlikely ever from the same route. Their response was, what you must do is you must repair the roof while the sun shines, not wait for the rains to come. So I said, well, the rains are never going to come under those circumstances. So what I want to do in this is to have a look at what happened as far as the global financial crisis is concerned, and come to a slightly different conclusion to anybody else. I've never seen anybody else come to this conclusion, so we can have lots of debates and discussions on this if you would like to have those debates. So our system which we put in, which is called the Twin Peaks system, one regulation for prudential, one regulation for something new, we've never had that before, called market conduct. Now that came from the UK, and the UK went for the single peak, twin peak. Whatever we do RDR, the UK has done RDR, so whatever they've done, that's what we do over here. So the justification comes from the UK system. So we must look at the UK leg of the global financial crisis, and that's what I plan to do in the next half hour or so. So we can have lots of interesting debates and discussions on it, if you like. And the conclusion I will come to is the UK leg of the financial crisis was the greatest regulatory and politicians' failure. I have difficulty knowing what I wanted to call that other one. Political failure? I don't think so. It is not something which was put forward by political parties. If you said who did it, I said try Gordon Brown. So it's really a politician's failure rather than a political failure. On the other hand, you might want to say, I think politicians and political is the same thing. Let's not be semantical about these sort of things. Let's call it about a political failure. But I think it's really a politician's failure rather than a political failure. And we'll have a look at that a little bit. And that's always linked to this burning question in the back of my mind. Can you show me the link between this regulatory system that we want and the failure which happened in the UK? And then, say, why did they do that? Why did the UK do what it did? So that's what we really want to have a look. So the conclusion I will get is really, in the UK at least, you can talk about a different argument in America, you can talk a different island in Portugal, Iceland, where all the banks collapsed. You can do that. It's all different. But the UK one is one I want to have a look at in greater detail. So what did we have? What I've already said, we have a Twin Peaks regulatory system, the most expensive, intrusive, invasive, draconian system ever devised. The cost to the public, 4.6 to 2 billion. The reason which is given, it's the global financial crisis, and the argument underlying that is that if you leave the market to operate by itself, the market failed, and so what we have got is a failure of unregulated markets. The solution to that is we now have to go and regulate those markets because they failed. And so the argument is market failure. Those who are economists, like a couple of people in this audience, and you'll be familiar with the idea that there's market failure, an idea which came from an economist by the name of Bretto in the 1950s, always equals to government intervention. The market can't do it, the government will have to intervene under those sort of circumstances. So in a sense, the idea that you argue that the market's failed, now we have regulation, it's like a direct marriage between the idea of a market failure and government intervention. And the very important point for our point of view, what we did in South Africa was take it over from the UK. I will argue and I think demonstrate quite clearly, because I have a slightly different approach to most economists on this particular point. It's the greatest pollutions and regulated failure. And when the crisis was unraveling, I did an earlier version of this sort of analysis, which I presented at the biennial conference of the South African Society of Economists, which I said, what is the nature of the failure we have at the moment? And I came to the conclusion, it's the same conclusion I hold today, yet to see many others come to the same conclusion. I think that Sir Mervyn, governor of the Bank of England, in his excellent book which he wrote in The End of Alchemy, comes to more or less the same conclusion. What we really witnessed was evidence of a money banking crisis. It's the banks that collapsed, insurance companies didn't collapse, stock markets didn't collapse. Stock markets actually did quite well at the end of it, so it wasn't there. What collapsed was the banks. And so what we should have said, it's a banking crisis, let's put regulation onto banks, let's have a look at banks. Instead of it, we said let's regulate everything except banks. So banks simply got ignored on the process and caused a particular problem. So it's that sort of logic. Now, I want to do this in terms of, it's always easy if you have simple questions to say, which I want to answer, because then it's easy when you do the analysis to keep an eye on what you're trying to answer. First of all, what happened? What was the response to what happened? And what are the consequences? Now, we are going to have to live in the years to come with the consequences, and those consequences from an economic perspective are not very promising or very attractive as such. So those are the three questions we want to look at. So we will start off with what happened. But I must say, whenever I do any research, there are three fundamental principles I always keep in mind. We'll only discuss two, we'll leave the third one out here. And that puts me on a slightly different track to quite a number of other people when they do research. And they are all very ancient principles. In this case, two of them go to a writer by the name of Sir Francis Bacon. The third one goes to John Locke. And as you can see, 1680 and 1638. I have a problem when I write articles, I send them to journals, they come back and they say, don't you have more recent and more up-to-date references? What I said, I quoted Adam Smith, 1774, but you know, the way that you do when you write, you simply give the name Smith, 1774, and the editor came back and said, don't you have something reference? And anyhow, who is the Smith guy? So I wrote back and said, if you don't know the Smith guy, it's my article does a blog in your journal, so don't worry about it. I know those things. Okay, I think Sir Francis Bacon has not received anywhere near the appreciation of his contribution to the intellectual debate. This statement, which he made here, appears in a work called the Novum Organum, and it has been a subject of debate for the 200 years since he, or nearly 300 years since he articulated this. This is one of the central philosophical debates which continue. At the time when he made it, everybody thought he was right, and they agreed he's right, but that didn't stop ending up with hundreds of years of debates and millions of pages on it. But the fundamental principle, which is important, which he's got there, and that is, man being the servant and interpreter of nature can do and understand so much, and only so much, only as he has observed. Beyond this, he neither knows anything nor can do anything. The only basis of truth at all is from observation. He was reacting against the idea that you can philosophically arrive at a truth. He said the only truth you can arrive is if you can observe that truth, otherwise it is not. Everybody incidentally agreed with this, even the Marxists. If you have a look at Engels in the book he wrote, he actually is a fan of this particular methodology, and he says Marxism is based on this very principle. And then he makes, I think for us, quite an interesting statement. If you cannot observe it, it's nothing but a figment of your imagination. So the difference between what I'm going to do and what you'll find in other ones, going to have a look at what actually happened. So it's not what you think happened, but what you can observe, and from that you come to a conclusion. Now, when I've had this discussion with some of my economics problems, they say, are you a Keynesian, a neo-Keynesian? Is this the exogenous theory of money? I say, look, I have no idea any of that. And if you read what Sir Francis was saying, he says, all of that is nonsense anyhow. All you have to do is look at what happened. So this is really an analysis of what happened. So from that we come to the conclusions. And then we can argue with the economists and tell them they actually haven't got a clue what they're talking about. Somewhere along this, I made very good friends with one of my colleagues, Nick Spearman at Wits University. We had lots of discussions and debates on this whole lot. And I said to Nick, look, we can have all this economic discussion you like, but if you deviate from this one policy, we can't talk anymore. And one day he came to me and said, let us assume we do not have banks. I said, Nick, we can now go and have coffee because we have nothing to talk about. Banks do exist. Now, the second principle comes from the same writer, but in a different book. Sir Francis was also an eminent lawyer. His life ended not as good as you like, but for us, very, very important. If you want to know what causes something, so what he says, to the cause of causes, there is no end. So some people will say the crisis was caused by bankers' greed, somebody by subprime. And you say, yeah, but can you show me how that links to the reality? No, just trust me, it comes from, so that links back to the first statement. So we only have a look at what actually happened and at the point of where it happens, not the remote causes. We can then, having discovered that, say, okay, let's go to the more remote causes and have a look at that. Okay, so there's a third principle from John Locke, which we don't need to worry about at this time. So what happened? Now, it's very simple for us to work out in the UK what happened, because we know where it started. It started with the collapse of Northern Rock, or one would argue it didn't get collapsed, the government took it over and all the rest, but when the Northern Rock got into problems. So all we have to do is have a look at the Northern Rock, which means we enter into a banking problem. Now, I got very good news for you. This thing is so simple once you do it this route to looking what happened, that even I understand it. And that's saying something. Okay, so what is Northern Rock? Northern Rock's what we would call a mortgage lender, what we would call a building society. So what it did, and it was aiming to become the biggest building society. They don't have building societies, the biggest mortgage bank in the UK, and was getting very close there. So is that not nice, simple? We can have a look at the asset side of the balance sheet, and what do we see from the asset balance sheet? It's made a lot of advances to people who've got houses. At the time when it got into difficulties, it had 120 billion asset book of loans. Now, a bank, of course, if you have a bank, if you go to the bank, you say, I've put a deposit, I would like to go and get my money. And now when we talk about money, we mean the stuff printed by the Reserve Bank, the stuff that you can see has got a face on there, or coins or something. So it's not credit in the bank, but real money. So banks also have to have amount of cash, and that's regulated by law, so that they want to make sure that if you go to the bank, you can get your cash. Simple enough, eh? So far, not too complicated. Okay. Next one.
Without cash, even if they weren't compelled to do so.
Yeah, they would have cash even if it was... Brian makes a very important point, because in this discussion, which I've had with a lot of people, I said, don't get confused and don't bring the regulatory requirements in. The regulatory requirements are not part of the fundamental way they work. So they would have cash irrespective if you're going to have it. Okay, Brian, we are going to stay friends at this point, but I think in the next slide we've got stopping friends.
Don't challenge me.
Okay, on this one we might start not being friends. Okay, now, one of the big difficulties that we have is such a lot of confusion about how banks operate, and there's no reason if you understand how they work. So let's take a very simple example. Let's to be able to understand that. Assuming that somebody, the purchaser, wishes to purchase a house for R1 million. So they come to me, I'm Northern Rock, the bank, and I say to them, you want R1 million? Not a problem. I will lend it to you. I'll tell you what you do. You go home, you get your checkbook. On your checkbook, you write out R1 million. You bring it back to me. And I'll stamp it, say guaranteed, providing you purchase that house, because I can send my surveyor to have a look at it, and it gets transferred into your name. And I then give him his little piece of paper, which is a check. Now, that piece of paper is only a piece of paper. It's not money, and it has no value. You can go home and tear it up. American banks, you might have a difficulty, but in the British and South African banks, you can tear it up. So you say, okay, now what you want to do is you want to go and buy a house. So if you buy a house, you go to the deeds office, and then they transfer it, and you get the deeds. So you say, okay, tell you what you do. You go and see a conveyancer. There's your conveyancer. And that conveyancer will transfer the property into your name, assuming that's the property. Okay. And then what you do is you go and meet in the conveyancer's office, takes the deeds, he takes a piece of paper, he looks at the piece of paper and says, the bank guarantees it, I'm happy with that piece of paper. The deeds office has transferred into your name. You can now take that property, and he gives a piece of paper, which is only a piece of paper, to the seller. A miraculous thing has happened. When the transfer took place, this piece of paper is now worth R1 million. Why? Because he exchanged the house for R1 million. So this piece of paper becomes R1 million. Now what happens? The seller says, I don't want to keep this piece of paper. I want to go and take it to the bank. So he brings it back to me, to the Northern Rock. Now, I didn't give anybody any money. I only stamped it, and I haven't accepted any money. I just accepted a piece of paper. Then what I do is I put another stamp on, say cancelled, and I send it back and say, you can put that in your records so you can know what happens. What I then do is in my set of accounts, I then record, I owe the seller R1 million. So now do you see what's happened? For every loan that I've given, it comes back into the bank as a deposit. And so we have a statement which is self-evident, but so often, so seldom said. Loans create the deposits. The deposit which we got on this side came from the loan I gave. And that loan and the deposit is exactly the same value. So on this side here, we have exactly the same value. Northern Rock's deposits come from all of the loans which it's got. Now, this is where Brian and I might have some sort of conversation. Brian, not too much of a conversation now. Is, in addition to the liabilities, I have shareholders. Now, if you understand what's happened over here, the loan's exactly equal to the advances, and I have no need for cash at all. The cash is available if somebody wants it. Now, where is the cash come from? Since it doesn't come from the loans, it can only come from the shareholders. So the shareholders' money in this, up to this situation, does nothing but convert into cash, which sits in the vault. And as long as it sits in the vault, it earns no income at all. You haven't got a bit of water, do you?
I'll go get some.
Okay, so that all looks fantastic. So we have a way the normal bank operates. It gives an advance. The advance comes back as to a liability, as a deposit, and it's in balance. If it doesn't come into this bank, it will go into another bank. But every loan which is ever granted results in a deposit. And in this way, the banking system is always kept in equilibrium. It becomes much more complicated once we start allowing money to go.
Just while you're waiting for your water, time for a quick question. So this idea that the deposits exactly match the advances on the mortgages, is that right? Because the mortgages might be over 20 or 25 years. So those deposits are be coming in systematically. So it's not at the same time that the deposits match the loans.
We'll pick it up on the next slide.
Okay.
We'll see. From the transactions which we've got, where the bank gives a loan, an advance, that then has to come back. So up to this stage, in the real world, we can get other things which confuse it, but it doesn't change the basic system.
That at some point the deposits would equal the loans, yeah? Or in fact, it should exceed the loans because the bank's loaning at a premium, yeah? Otherwise, it wouldn't be loaning it.
Well, it can never exceed that. It's always going to be an exact balance. But we can have that debate later.
And the liabilities are always going to balance.
Assets and liabilities will always.
You might start the story. How do you start a bank?
No, now you're getting to the place I got with Nick, where Nick says, let's assume we got no banks. I'll say, let us not have a conversation. We have a bank.
Starts with equity capital.
Yeah.
And with cash. And then attracts the capital.
Yeah.
Incidentally, this is one of the oldest shibboleths in in monetary theory, that banks create money.
And you know,
If we can't persuade people otherwise, we really failed in our economics.
notice I have not done that. What I've said is that the loans create the deposit.
Sorry, Robert, may I pose a point here? Notice, is it your preference to present your case upfront and then entertain questions afterwards?
I think so, because what would happen, some of the stuff is so interesting, we'll never get through the presentation.
Yeah. Well, okay, let us take through the part. There is that slot to question and answers, so you can raise all these points.
And in fact, a lot of the questions won't become relevant to what follows from thereafter. Unfortunately, that's why I say, my colleague Nick and I, we discussed this for about 10 years, and we wrote articles and went on the internet and had conversations with people all around the world. So what would happen, we will never get out of here, which is fine, I love it, but that's a different issue. Okay, so that's the system we got. Now what would happen is we can accept that not everybody who gets a loan from Northern Rock will want to go and put their money in Northern Rock. They say, look, we invest with real banks, not building societies, so I want to put my money into another bank. So we have to introduce the other bank into the story, which will happen now. So there's another bank over here. Now here we get an interesting development which happens. So if we take that little there, and we'll assume those decided that they bank in another bank. So their deposits are not made in this bank, their deposits are made in this bank. So that's their deposits over there. Under those circumstances, this other bank becomes a collecting bank, and then we'll go over to Northern Rock and say, can you please pay us because we've got the deposit from the loan which you've given, you've guaranteed the check, so will you please give us the money? And that's the amount of money that they will have. Now, what would happen in this other bank, it does not have an income generating asset. The income generating asset is in Northern Rock. That's the loan which he's got. So Northern Rock can say, we can pay you. Only assets we've got is cash, or is loans which we can't give you, or we can take you some of our cash and forget the regulatory requirement, and we will then send your cash. So your cash will increase by that amount over there, and everybody will be happy. But then this bank says, no. Why do I want your cash? Because cash does not generate any income, so let us rather have a loan. So we will borrow them, allow you to borrow the money until we need it. And so that is in the interbank system. Now what was happening at the time of Northern Rock is these deposits in the other bank were sitting there for 6 months. So it's an overnight, instantaneous, what we would call an electronic fund transfer type of transaction. In the money market, they were standing there for a period of some 6 months before Northern Rock would clear those loans. Now also Northern Rock, which is a mortgage bond loaner which has got lending things for 30 years, they can't run a bank on deposits and interbank loans. So they have to find a different source to be able to fund that loan. And that the other source is the one that caused the problem which was about to arise. Okay. They discovered they could access funds through the securitization process, what Mervyn King when he wrote about this, called it the wholesale market. And so what they then is went to the wholesale market through the securitization process, and they accessed funds from that. And so the interbank loan would build up for a period of 6 months. So we'd go to the securitization market, get some money, pay those down, and start again. And so at the time of its collapse, this is what we had. We had shareholders' liabilities, securitization notes, about 50 billion rand, deposits, 20 billion rand, and then an unspecified amount. That amount would vary. It was about 20 billion at the time, or 10 billion at the time, which we've got. Okay, so that's on the liability side. That's very cute, is it not? Now, if you want to see the actual figures, these are the figures which Northern Rock had sent to the Bank of England as part of its stress test. So this graph comes from the Bank of England's records, and they got this every couple of months from the various banks. There you can see it. The bottom part over here, interbank loans, or interbank deposits, what they call, deposits by other banks. Then we have retail deposits. Those are the deposits of people who bought the property. And then this big chunk over here, so I estimate about 50 billion in the securitization market. And so it would work. Now, look at what happened over a period of time. The deposits are fairly constant, slight upward there. So increasingly less and less was it able to fund the advances it made from the deposits got. So it didn't make much of a contribution. Increasingly, you can see that part over there was the securitization notes. There were, over there. Fantastic. Anybody see a risk? Anybody know the risk? Can you see it? This was given to the Bank of England as part of the standard reporting system. So the governor of the Bank of England and his different committees, they've all got this every day. They can just push the screen and say what it is. Anybody see the risk? Because you see the risk and you understand what happened. Nobody see the risk.
Well, of course, you depending on the loans that other banks are making you. If they withdraw those loans, you can't pay them back.
That's the least of the problems, because those banks are happy to leave it with, because on their side they have an asset which would be cash, which wouldn't reserve any interest. So they say we're happy to leave it for 6 months, and they're all leaving for 6 months to whoever's got the interest, income generating, in this case Northern Rock, income generating asset. So that's fine. Next risk, getting close. Hey?
Regulation risk.
No, that time there was no regulation. We come to regulation after this. That's what they thought. Next risk.
The value of the security.
No. Very, very important point. Very important point. At no point of time was the value of securities an issue. In other words, they got Rolls-Royce securities, loans based by fixed property, the best of all loans. So at no time did anybody worry about whether Northern Rock had a problem. Mervyn King in his book tries to backtrack a bit and said, the loans weren't as good as they said. but it was not.
There are two risks. If you're a leveraged organization, there are two risks. One, your lenders may withdraw support. The other risk is the loans you made, which on assets may prove to be not as valuable as you thought they would be. And if you have to write off the assets, all you've got left is, all you've got to compensate for those losses is your equity capital. Now you go broke if the equity capital doesn't cover your losses. And then if you go broke, that way people may become very unwilling to lend to you.
Okay.
So then you may be able to raise new capital, you may be able to persuade the banks to keep your money with you, but your fundamental problem is you made poor loans.
Fantastic. Two risks. Equity risk, two risks. Solvency risk, something wrong with your loan book, and the other one is your lenders withdraw, called a liquidity risk. So those are the two risks that a bank faces, those two. Now, in this case, the big problem would be what would happen if the securitization market pulled out. There would be a 50 billion rand shortfall. Okay, now what happened? Securitization market collapsed on the 9th of August 2007. Paribas Bank in France announced it's closing its 3 securitization funds down. It closed its funds down. Every securitization fund in the world closed down. So now Northern Rock has got 50 billion in that fund, which is short-term funding which it would have to pay back, and has no substitute lenders to be able to pay back. So very important. The problem it faces is a liquidity problem, not a solvency problem. Never had a problem on the solvency time. Okay, security notes redeemed by issuing more security notes. Notes could not be redeemed. Not only could the notes not be redeemed, there were £10 billion in interbank loans which could not be paid back. That £10 billion is now on the asset side of another bank, which has to be at most supported by the equity, which would be less than the total amount in there. So all banks in England would go insolvent if Northern Rock went insolvent and couldn't pay it down, pulling one bank out, then pull the next, and then the next. They would all collapse because the securitization market collapsed at that particular point you got. Now, if you look at the figures which I've shown you, and you try to estimate that the securitization loan by itself was 50 billion rand. So Northern Rock needed to get a substitute lender for 50 billion rand. Now, if it became public knowledge that Northern Rock cannot pay it back, the retail depositors will start queuing up to get their money, and then eventually we would need 120 billion rand to get Northern Rock not to collapse and not to pull the rest of the market down. Simple, easy to see. Now, if you're the governor of the Bank of England, or if you're sitting in the Bank of England and you're monitoring, you look at that stress diagram and you could sit there any time and say, I can see that will be a problem. You didn't need it to collapse to see it's a problem, so you've got to say, okay, if that happens, What is our solution? How do we resolve this? Do we let Northern Rock go down? It goes down, it pulls all the banks go down, and it pulls down the payment system. So the whole of the UK, and we've never lost the entire payment system, the whole of UK would be gone. And we have no idea how to ever be able to resurrect that system. Okay. But very important point, two risks, solvency, liquidity. It still had 120 billion rand on assets, which there were no difficulty with the assets at all. Not an asset problem, just a liquidity problem, which we have got. And incidentally,
Sell its assets.
eh?
You see, it solves its liquidity problem if it can cash in the assets.
Yeah, but it can't cash its assets. So
So that's the problem. You say the assets were worth 120 billion. If they were worth 120 billion, they could have realized 100 and paid off all their liabilities. But of course, the asset side deteriorates because in a time of crisis, everybody's trying to sell assets, and the value of those assets falls away.
Yeah.
They don't
Negative
stay.
equity in the States. That's what happened in the States with the housing market. When they started selling the houses, they couldn't recover the cost of the loan.
yeah, precisely. So what we have to find is how you're supposed to manage this problem. We can say we're going to sell all our houses. That might take you 5 years.
Yeah.
By which time all the banks are gone anyhow. So
Houses are worth bugger all anyway because you flooded the market.
So you've got to work out how to manage this particular crisis, and that's what the Bank of England's responsibility was, to say if we ever get this. Now, the Bank of England had not had to deal with a run for 140 years. So that meant there were probably 20 governors in that office who never dealt with anything near this crisis and didn't even have to understand it. So the question is, you remember a short while ago there was a plane which took off from LaGuardia Airport, ran into a flat of birds, and lost its engine and landed in the Hudson and saved everybody's life. So you've got to hope, but when this thing happens, that the governor over there knows something about banking. So he can't say, wait, let's think if we can sell all these assets quickly. Let's have an auction on these assets. He's got to say, how do we deal with this thing? And hopefully he went to a university that taught him. And hopefully his whole staff know how to deal with it. It doesn't look like any of them knew how to deal with it.
So
Okay.
those deposits that the people queued up to withdraw.
We need to get on track.
Yeah, okay, let's just finish and then we'll do the questions. Okay, so here we are. Problem. Liquidity. It's not a solvency problem. It's a liquidity problem. That's the only problem it had to deal with. Okay, have we got it? Liquidity. Very important. If I had to ask you a question, don't answer it because then we won't get through. African Bank over here collapsed. Was that a liquidity problem or was it a solvency problem? Don't answer it because then we'll never get out of here. Okay, now what is the solution to a liquidity problem? The solution was given that you create a central bank which is the lender of last resort. That theory was worked out in 1802 and then developed further in 1873, 200 years ago. So for 200 years we've known if we ever have to confront a liquidity problem, there is only one solution to this problem. We can make other solutions, but you can't do them in the time that's going to be there. The central bank says, we lend you the money. Just to make sure you get the rules, what you must do, lend without any hesitation, without any limit other than the assets, and at a penalty rate. So when the CEO phoned up this central bank and said, look, we have got a 50 billion rand problem, we need money, they should have simply said, we've now opened a line of exchange for you, you can now take the money, and that's the end of this crisis. Okay. And the theory is, if you know that's going to happen, you don't get the crisis, because there's no point to a crisis. If you want to see it work in practice in South Africa, those of you who are old enough, and there's only a couple in the room will be old enough, you'll remember we had a run on Nedbank a couple of years ago, going back a couple of years, and people were starting to queue outside. That night, the governor of the Reserve Bank came on TV, said, I have no idea why you want to go and take money out of the Nedbank. I'll guarantee you that tomorrow when you get there, if you want to get your money, you can get it. It will be there, but you're just being stupid, so you're just going to have to put it back. Next morning when it opened up, there was no queue. Okay, so if you get the story right, then you stop the liquidity crisis. Okay. Okay, so what did the Bank of England do? Just to recoup, securitization market collapsed at August the 9th. It already had the diagram in front of it. It would know that if it's collapsed, 50 billion rand missing, there are no other lenders queuing up. Only solution, we will lend you the money to get through the crisis. We do that, there is no banking crisis, which we got. A month later, so after having met with dozens of committees all over the government, with the Vice-Chancellor, the Chancellor, the National Treasury, the regulator. They couldn't decide what to do. So a month later, they set out a statement: we are not going to have to help Northern Rock. We are not going to help Northern Rock. That would create a moral hazard. And if we help Northern Rock, we're going to have to help other banks if they get into trouble, and we refuse to do that. That's the job of the central bank. It would not do that. And then I think the truth dawned. If you don't help Northern Rock, the banking system collapses, the payment system collapses, and then a couple of days later, Mervyn King appears on TV to say, okay, we're now going to give them assistance. We give them 10 billion. They needed 50 billion. 10 billion doesn't really help. And here we have a remarkable thing that happened, because normally you get a run before the bank intervenes, and this time the run started after the bank intervened. So it means the public either didn't understand or didn't have any confidence that the Bank of England could be able to start of it. So in the end, the liquidity was provided through quantitative easing, and instead of being 50 billion, in the end it cost them 350 billion. So we would have been able to solve it. And incidentally, it doesn't cost the bank anything. It's a loan at a penalty interest rate. So whatever they advance comes back to the Bank of England, gets paid off, and the thing's same. So it doesn't cost the taxpayer. It is not a cost to anybody. It is simply a liquidity facility which you got. And Mervyn King, they said to him, when you lent 350 billion, why did you stop? He said, no other bank wanted it. Nobody wanted any more liquidity. So what they should have done in day one, said, you got all the liquidity you want. Instead, they said, we're not going to give any liquidity. After it collapsed, worked out what happened. So I don't think that they dealt with this in terms of the fundamental rules of the lender of last resort at all. The Governor Bank says later, which is very important, that he really did want to help Northern Rock. But when he met with all these committees, they said he can't help Northern Rock because it would be illegal. Now, one of the things that regulation does, it destroys all innovation. Now, I've done this, I don't know how many times in my own life, when we want to do a problem, say, that's my idea, how do we solve it? Somebody around the table says it's illegal, can't be done. The last one, I actually kept the email, so in future when people say, I have an idea, I'm going to send them the email. You'll always get somebody on a committee in a regulatory state saying you can't do it, so it's illegal. Regulatory states destroy all innovation. Without innovation, there is no market. So one of the side effects of regulation is its destruction. So when Mervyn King appeared before the National Treasury on television, they said, why didn't you help Northern Rock? He said, no, I wanted to help them covertly. Now, you can't help people covertly, because the idea is that you must know that Northern Rock is not going to collapse, so it has to be overtly. So he didn't get that rule right at all. And he said, but I was told that would be illegal. So before I could do that, I would have to meet with the Vice-Chancellor, I'd have to meet with the Treasury, I'd have to meet. And eventually they said, we've come to an agreement. We published it on the website. Why government departments have to enter into agreements with themselves, I have no idea. I would have thought the government enters an agreement with third parties, not itself. So the regulatory state creates committees which cause the destruction which come and will not solve any problems, because they create the problems which they have got. Okay, it was caused. So to answer the question, what did we have when Northern Rock got pulled down? The rest of the market follows from that. We had a banking crisis caused by the manifestation of the liquidity risk, which was resolved as only can be via the injection of liquidity. But don't forget, all the banks were regulated. They were all regulated in terms of Basel. And Basel, best international practice. So Basel would be okay. Basel should have stopped it. Best the solution was not innovation, but more regulation. Said Basel II maybe didn't do it, we'll give you Basel III. Okay, now I have argued that this is the greatest regulatory failure that we've had in history. Now I want to show you why it is the greatest regulatory failure. Two risks, Brian correctly told us, faces a bank: a solvency risk, a liquidity risk. This was a liquidity risk. This was regulated by Basel Accord. So that was fantastic. So all we have to ask ourselves is, how did Basel II deal with the liquidity problem? Mervyn King, in a paper which he presented later, tells us. The Basel framework, this is after 3 was out, focuses on the asset side of the balance sheet. Basel II excluded all consideration of liquidity and the liability structure of the balance sheet. So no wonder they never looked at that liability side because the Basel never looked at the liability side. In the mind of the Basel people, the only risk you face is a solvency risk, which is in the asset side. In this case, it was the liability side. No one looked at the liability side because the Basel rules ignored the liquidity risk as if it didn't exist. It's the greatest risk banks face, which you've got. So the world regulator of banks did not understand that the banks failed from liquidity. So it's the greatest regulatory failure. And not only that, look what Northern Rock had done. He said, of all the major banks, the one which had the highest capital ratio, believe it or not, was Northern Rock. Within weeks of announcing that it was Basel II compliant, it had repatriated its funds to the shareholders, saying it does not need it. It then ran out of money. So it complied precisely with the regulations, and the regulations never understood banking and never understood the biggest risk facing is a liquidity risk. So there is no solution to this day for liquidity. Basel III now touches on it, still haven't found a way of dealing with it. So when we say we are now going to deal with the next financial crisis, which will be a liquidity risk, what are we going to deal with? Defective regulations, because they still don't understand which come. Not my view, the view of a professor in RMIT specialized in banking. He's much more upset about this than what I have got. So there is the biggest regulation failure. The thing that caused the financial crisis was never governed by the regulations. The managers of banks will say, we do not worry about managing this survival of this bank. What we do is we comply with the government regulations. When you go to the government regulation, they say, we don't set these regulations, they're set in Basel. So now we find ourselves being regulated not by a government, but by somebody that's not elected somewhere else drawing up defective regulations, and we don't even know those regulations are defective, which we've got. The greatest regulatory failure in the history. So the global financial crisis, if that was the greatest crisis, it was caused by a defect in the greatest regulatory system we've had. Okay, which brings me to the point I've already touched on. Who are our regulators? Now, we would think we've got a twin peak system. There's one regulator, there's another regulator. But in this case, the banking regulations didn't come from it. They came from another organization which is now non-elected, have nothing to say. You don't know who they are. All you say is, we will accept their regulations as they're going to work. You say, who's going to examine whether they? Our national treasury. Or the people that didn't even know that there was a liquidity crisis they're supposed to deal with. So there's no one examining these regulations at all. So we've got a very strange system which has evolved. There are an increasing number of international organizations which are not elected, drawing up the standards for everybody to follow, and those standards are defective. They don't work, and they're too complex to be followed anyhow. So we have the International Accounting Standards, and if you now read the comments which are coming about Steinhoff and Tongot Ulot, they say these all complied with the international standard, but we can't make any sense of these standards. So we have got very complex rules been made from somebody we didn't elect, and they in practice do not work under those. We have now got an International Association of Insurance Supervisors. So all our insurance companies are going to be elected, going to put in rules drawn up by a committee which were never elected, and those people who are drawing them up are so far removed from the operation of what they're regulating, they wouldn't have a clue what to regulate at all. Unelected, unaccountable, unworkable, out of touch with reality, and as in the case of the liquidity problem which England faced, totally useless under this. So it's increasingly, people are beginning to understand these things. These systems are unnecessarily complex, out of touch, and in the case of banking, liquidity problem, absolutely useless under there. Now, what was the response to this? Now, one would have thought the response is to have a very good look at banks and banking regulation. No, we have a completely different response. We want to create a second regulator. So you're going to say, what was wrong with the system we had, which is in England, the Financial Services Authority? They said, no, the Financial Services Authority didn't understand banks. It's totally out of touch. So you think, okay, shut it down, get rid of all those useless people that did it. No. Leave them there. They can be one peak. We'll start another peak. So that's where we get the other 2 billion rand. First billion rand on a regulator that didn't work. Now another regulator, which we're going to go and start over there. So we have the failed single peak regulator with Financial Authority, and it morphed itself into a different regulation. Why did it morph itself into it? Because when Lord Turner gave evidence, they said, why didn't you pick up the banking regulation problem? So I don't understand banking. I must say that you've got to admire Lord Turner. Since he's given up this job, he's now made a lifetime study of banks. He's just published a book on banks. Okay. It's a bit late, but at least his heart's in the right place. That he's going to go overdo it. And he said, no, what we did was we read the financial press every day and we looked what was worrying everybody, and that's the things that we looked at. So it had taken a life of its own. When you create a regulator and you say you have a job, if it doesn't know what the job is, it soon makes its own job. And then they said, okay, let's make that official now. We'll call it the market conduct regulator. So the second one is the market. Then they went over. What about the substantive regulation to prevent another liquidity-driven crisis? We've just had one, so what regulations are in place to prevent it? First of all, the banks are not going to do it because they say we don't do the regulation. It comes from the government. The government says we know it comes from Switzerland. So the answer to that is none. The Basel III doesn't deal with the liquidity crisis clearly enough, so it's not going to have it. Instead, what it says, let's make a draconian, intrusive regulation of pension funds and insurance companies. And this is a problem I've always had. I said, what's that got to do with banks? This was a banking crisis. No, you don't know what you're talking about. We're going to regulate these other people who don't know how to behave themselves. So we've got a new system. Okay, and it's quite disconnected from the things. And what we did in South Africa, which is the reason why I've always looked at this thing, is we just mirrored what was happened in there. Okay, now what are the consequences? This is where we are at this particular point. Going forward, what is the process? We have created two peak regulators, but they're not regulators in the traditional sense of the word. They are not producing rules for you to follow. That's what you think of a regulation. You know, there's a regulation, drive on the left side of the road. We all drive on the left side. It's a system of regulators, not registrars. It's an administrative system. So they see themselves as administering the financial services market. And in doing so, they have the ability to raise their own taxes, which are called levies, which we've had some success because when they went to Parliament last time, we had pointed out, the Free Market Foundation had pointed out that this is just a tax. And when they came to the committee stage, the committee asked National Treasury, is this thing a tax, this levy? And they said, no, it's just a levy. So, but they said, if you're unsure about it, we'll go and get a legal opinion. So they came back and they said, look, our legal opinion says it's not a tax, but it just might be. But to be safe, we'll now have a money bill. So we had some sort of success in getting them to understand that this is a tax and requires a money bill. But all taxes also require appropriation. You know, the Parliament must then approve the expenditure. There is no appropriation of any of this expenditure, which means the executives can pay themselves what they like. The executives over here earn, I think, 4 times what the state president earns. Why? Because they can determine themselves, they pass it on to the society, and there we're going to get. The laws are not regulations by the minister. The laws are regulations they make themselves. And in an earlier representation made by Free Market Foundation, that seems to have had some impact, because we said you can't do that. They said, okay, we'll have a compromise. When we've passed these regulations, we'll table them in Parliament. I'm not sure what tabling in Parliament means. I don't know that anywhere at all. So ability to impose administrative penalties and recover the costs from their costs from those there. And this is all very foreign from what we have. So going forward, we don't have regulation in terms of the rule of law. We have administrators who are basically going to try and tell the financial markets what to do. And that will have major negative impacts, not least of all on innovation. You will find that boards will not be trying to innovate, they'll be trying to get compliance. Do we comply? Do we comply? And you say, if you have any problem, you will always find somebody, whatever you want to do, it's illegal, just as Mervyn King discovered. So you'll find virtually all innovation, one of the consequences will dry up as a result of that. Okay. The new system we got, there it is. This is a bureaucratic paradise. This is the new act which passed. We spent a lot of time trying to understand it. It consists at this stage of a host of committees. This is what Mervyn King discovered when he wanted to lend money. You can't. You've got to go into that committee, that committee, that committee, and they all said it's illegal. So he couldn't do anything. So we're going to have the same thing. We've created all the committees that didn't work. No substantive regulations at this point in time. Okay, I have dealt with the fact that it is a regulatory failure. Now, where did the politicians fail? Now, why did we have a problem, and instead of solving that problem, we created a bureaucracy. Now, that's odd. And then I realized that's what bureaucrats always do. So they never solve problems. So, for example, Management 101, to solve a problem, you direct the resources at the problem itself. If the problem is a fire risk, then what you install is firefighting protection and systems over there. if the politicians get involved, what they say is, let's establish a bureaucracy, and it will solve the problem. They established the FSA, which has now been disbanded to look after the banking risk which arose after the rise of Barings Bank. So that was its job. Barings Bank is a major disaster, and they said the Bank of England doesn't know how to manage banks. We're going to create this new body. They will manage banks. When this thing took place, FSA had to admit that it actually didn't understand anything in banks, didn't do anything in banks, so it didn't do its job at all. So the politicians keep creating bureaucracies with a view that bureaucracy will solve the problem, and in reality, they never solve any problems at all. So we have a regulatory failure, we had no regulations to deal with this risk, and we have a bureaucracy that didn't know what to do, and so both of those failed. And so the UK disaster, which we have now followed their system, was the greatest regulatory and political failure that we've had. That's the point I wanted to make. Thanks a lot. Sorry, I'm 10 minutes over time.
Thank you all for coming today. As Timba and Robert pointed out, over-regulation or ill-advised regulation, ill-structured regulation, or regulation that is poorly administered and allows a lot of discretion, which opens the door to corruption, strangles economic activity, growth, and entrepreneurship. The term red tape is well advised because you can imagine red tape itself strangling economic activity. Our job here today is in part to learn from the past, as Robert pointed out, but our key job is to try to look at the regulatory environment now in South Africa, see what's wrong with it, what can be corrected, and to take the warnings that Robert and Timba gave in their talks about the growth of regulation and the huge damage that an over-regulated or poorly regulated economy can do to the growth of prosperity and jobs in an economy. Now, with apologies to those who were here yesterday, I'm going to very quickly go through my presentation and then take a specific look at what's happening in the regulatory framework in South Africa today. And let me emphasize again, this is our task, to look at the regulatory environment in South Africa today, how it can be improved, and how dangers of future over-regulation can be seen off. Let me start, of course, by thanking the Free Market Foundation and the Atlas Network for sponsoring this tremendous series of events. I cannot tell you how lucky South Africa is to have the Free Market Foundation. Way back when Timba, Leon Lowe, and Eustace Davey established the Free Market Foundation to take up the good fight, the fight against apartheid and the fight for free markets. The battle against apartheid they've won, and Leon, I wish you all the luck in the world in winning the battle against an over-centralized and choked-up economy, the battle for free markets. And Timba, let me say the same thing to you. I also want to thank the folks who helped specifically with this session. Jason has done a marvelous job. Timba has, of course, played the key role of chair, and Colette, who I don't think is here right now, has really helped with everything. I know there is some concern right now about the future of South Africa. Due to electrical blackouts, the light at the end of the tunnel has been turned off. But our job is to seek the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, I am going to start with a little bit of background on overall economic freedom. because we're here today to talk about specifically regulation in South Africa as it is today and as it may evolve in the future. It's important to realize the overall benefits of free markets, economic freedom. So what is economic freedom? Individuals have economic freedom when the property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft. And by the way, hopefully South Africa is coming out of its period of force, fraud, and theft into a new era right now, is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, or give their property so long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. That's an academic's way of saying economic freedom is the ability of families and individuals to make their own economic decisions, to unleash the drive, entrepreneurship, and innovation that are the sole property of individuals, not the crushing weight of government planning or the greed of crony capitalists. It's entrepreneurship, drive, and ingenuity which pushes an economy forward. We look at 5 areas: size of government and taxation. If government taxes away too much of your property, it reduces your economic freedom. If government spends too much, even if the money flows from heaven or an oil well, if it spends too much, it reduces the space for free exchange and thus reduces economic freedom. Tomorrow we'll be talking about private property and the rule of law. This is similar to regulation, and it is the absolute foundation, more important than any of the others, the absolute foundation of economic freedom. Without the rule of law, without property rights, where the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak are treated equally, then economic freedom is simply limited to a crony elite or powerful government officials. The rule of law, which treats all alike, or all alike as much as possible, is the absolute foundation of the rule of law. And one could say the same about regulation. Sound money, government can expropriate your property through inflation every bit as easily as it can through taxation. South Africa needs the world as its marketplace. It will not grow rich on trading with just the 55 million people in South Africa. It needs the 9 billion people in the world as its marketplace. Regulation of business, labor, credit, and capital markets. This is what we're discussing today. Businesses should be able to set up and close down without undue red tape. Folks should be able to work for whom they wish, and employers should be able to hire whom they wish at freely negotiated rates, rather than government set rates which simply lose track of local conditions or individual needs. And capital markets, Robert gave a very in-depth view of how capital markets can get tied up in red tape and how a crisis can lead to even more red tape. Economic rights are actually the fundamental freedoms. If you do not have economic freedom, then powerful crony capitalists or powerful government can suppress dissent, freedom of speech, because they determine whether you get a job, whether you get ahead, whether you can feed and clothe your family, even whether you can travel. So without economic rights, without economic freedom, people become dependent upon the powerful or the government, and that limits all their other freedoms. You know, I occasionally talk to radical students, and I say to them, well, everyone knows that free markets, capitalism, are anti-democratic, that you can't have freedoms where there are free markets and capitalism, and they're all nodding happily. And then I say, okay, well, if that's true, can anyone name me a stable democracy that exists in a country without free markets? And suddenly they get confused. I say, can anyone name me a country where citizens have high levels of prosperity, aside from the petrostates, that do not have free markets. And again, they get confused. This is a very odd phenomenon. In one corner of their brains, they have this ideological belief against free markets and in favor of government control. And then in the actual knowledge part of their brain, they realize that the best countries to live, where refugees flee to, all have free markets. They realize that when you look around the world, it's only countries that have free markets that have stable democracy. And yet somehow the facts never, ever intrude upon the ideology. It's a very strange thing. So let's look at the facts right now. So, reflections on the obvious, I call it. If you listen to the socialists, the era of free markets, of globalization, of individual economic freedom has been a disaster for people. Poverty has increased massively around the world. Capitalism, free markets throw people into dire straits. Well, this is what has happened to global poverty in the era of free markets. It has been cut by 2/3. Isn't that incredible? While the socialists, while the poorly named economic freedom fighters are complaining against free markets and the creation of poverty, poverty has declined in the era of free markets. But this isn't the true miracle. Look at this. The same period of time, the global population has increased massively. But from 1950, as the era of globalization and free markets took hold after the Second World War, 3/4 of the world's population lived in dire poverty. Today, only about 1/10 of the world's population live in dire poverty. But our leftist friends will say, hey, that's too much. Why can't free markets end all poverty? Well, the fact is, they do. This level of poverty is maintained by nations that refuse to adopt free markets. Let's take a look at this. In the least economically free nations, 50% of the population live in $3.20 a day poverty. It's almost disappeared in free market nations. And the reason that exists at all is because it's still in the process of disappearing in nations that have moved to free markets. In other words, the poverty in the world today is maintained not by free markets, but by those who refuse to accept free markets. Government control or crony capitalist control of the economy takes you back to poverty levels of the 50s. Free markets take you to the disappearing poverty level, hopefully, of the future. In economically free nations, the poorest 10% have an income of over $10,000 US a year in purchasing power parity. In the least free, under $1,000 a year. So in free market economies, the poor are actually rich by many nations' standards. And yet somehow these facts don't intrude on the ideological. Per capita GDP in the era of globalization has expanded hugely. And again, it's the free market economies that have driven this expansion. So the average per capita income in a free market economy is about $40,000 US a year compared to under $6,000. Now I know some are going to say, that's because rich nations have always been rich and this is just sort of inheritance. That is completely false. It runs counter to the actual facts of the world. Taiwan was settled by fleeing refugees from mainland China. It was a disaster in Taiwan. It didn't inherit any wealth. It is now one of the richest nations in the world. Singapore was a spit of land built on swamp. It is now one of the richest places in the world. Chile was once one of the poorest nations in South America. It moved to free markets in a way none of us would approve of, by the way. It moved to free markets, and it is now by far the wealthiest nation in Latin America. What are the historic wealthy nations in Latin America? Argentina, and believe it or not, Venezuela. In 1970, Venezuela was the richest nation in Latin America, and by far. Venezuela was brought down. Don't just blame Hugo Chavez. You can blame him for a lot of stuff, but he's not solely responsible. Venezuela was afflicted by crony capitalism. In 1970, it was one of the 10 economically freest nations in the world. That was when it was also by far the wealthiest nation in Latin America. Crony capitalists got their evil, greedy hands on the oil flow. And Venezuela went from being an economically free society to one captured by crony capitalists. It declined like that in economic freedom. And the crony capitalists, evil little buggers, paved the way for Hugo Chavez and his radical solution, and the decline in living standards just went like that. Fairly similar story in Zimbabwe. Literacy. Well, illiteracy rather, has declined dramatically in the era of globalization and free markets. But again, the miracle is when you look at what's happened to literacy. Literacy has moved from this level to this level. And again, where are the gains concentrated? In economically free societies. By the way, I should have explained, these are quartiles. The quartile on your far left is what's happening in the least economically free nations. This is what's happening in the most economically free nations. Illiteracy has virtually disappeared in the most economically free nations. It is still prevalent in the least free nations. And perhaps even more important, the gap between men and women, boys and girls, in illiteracy closes in the most free nations. That's in part because in the most free nations, you actually have opportunity. If you build skills, you can get ahead, whether you're a man or a woman. Now, women are still prejudiced against in many ways in almost all nations, but the prejudice actually declines in the most free nations, closing the gap in opportunity, not completely, but closing the gap in opportunity and closing the gap in skills. In the most free nations, actually there are more women in university these days than there are men. Life expectancy. Now, unfortunately, this chart only goes back to 1990, but there's been a huge expansion of life expectancy. And again, it is concentrated in the most free nations. I'm awfully glad that I grew up in an economically free nation like Canada, because in the least free nations, I'd be dead. And in the most free nations, I have another 15 or 20 years worth of life ahead of me. Other benefits. Well, for the reasons I discussed earlier, economic freedom and civil rights. The gender gap closes in the most free nations, as mentioned. Infant mortality declines incredibly in the most free nations. And here is my favorite chart. Many who oppose free markets say, well, have kind of given up on the prosperity and economic growth idea. It's just so obvious. So they say, but who really cares about prosperity or the material things in life? Who can be happy in a dog-eat-dog free market world? Well, surprise, people actually like to be in control of their lives. One of the very, very few independent variables that a significant amount of research has shown has a positive effect on happiness is economic freedom. Now, this research is done by socialists who have the general reputation of being lefties themselves. So you can imagine they aren't particularly fond of their own results, or many of them. Sociologists, yeah. This is from sociology magazines and research publications. I imagine most of them started out as, well, we'll show free markets destroy happiness. And then they go, oh, Jesus. Yeah. Anyways, significant boost to happiness in free markets. So economic freedom in Africa, focus on South Africa. South Africa's fork in the road, away from economic freedom, improved status quo under the new and effective president, or towards economic freedom. So away from economic freedom, Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Improved status quo, Greece, Argentina. This is what it looks like. And then 2, economic freedom, happiness and joy. So look at economic freedom over time. Zimbabwe is, an up and down disaster. South Africa, of course, gained in economic freedom as apartheid came apart and freedom was offered to the fuller population. But sadly, economic freedom has been declining in South Africa. This is the status now. Rwanda had a burst in economic freedom in recent years, as you can see. Botswana has been consistently the sub-Sahara African leader in economic freedom. South Africa is behind the world average, and then you have sub-Sahara Africa even lower, and Zimbabwe way down there, despite improvements in recent years. And look what happens with economic growth. People talk about the Asian tigers and somehow believe an Asian tiger would be a foreign creature in Africa. Let me tell you, the most economically free African nation over time, Botswana, is the African tiger. It has grown at roughly the same rate as Singapore. Now, people are going to say, but Botswana has all sorts of natural resources, diamonds, of course. Well, South Africa has all sorts of natural resources. Nigeria has all sorts of natural resources. Angola has all sorts of natural resources. It's not natural resources or the lack of them that actually create prosperity. Nations with lots of natural resources like Nigeria and Angola can be complete disasters, while other nations with lots of natural resources with good economic policy, Norway, for example, and Botswana, create prosperity for their own citizens. People, by the way, just on a tangent, people sometimes think the Scandinavian nations are socialist. Nothing could be further from the truth. They have large government, but in every other way, they are favorable to entrepreneurship and business. Their regulations are amongst the most business entrepreneurship friendly in the world, and they are all great free traders. Policies in Scandinavian nations other than the size of government would horrify most left-wingers as being far too free market. Then since 1995, Rwanda, which has gained an economic freedom, though politically I worry about it, has had incredible growth, surpassing Singapore. Botswana is still in the race with Singapore. South Africa is way down here, even below the sub-Saharan African average. And of course, Zimbabwe has had negative growth over the time. I call a country like Zimbabwe crony socialism. It combines the worst of crony capitalism and the worst of socialism for an absolute disaster. That's what happened in Venezuela too, which went from crony capitalism to crony socialism. Crony capitalism is a really ugly, bad thing, but it takes crony socialism to drive a country into complete despair. So let's look at regulation in South Africa. And with apologies for going through that general introduction to economic freedom, this is our focus today. These are the ranks of South Africa out of 162. South Africa comes, our regulation category is made up of credit regs, labor regs, and business regs. South Africa is 74th in the world out of 162. That's not as bad as some other categories, but as Robert pointed out, all too often the politicians and the regulators look to more regulation, not less in the future. The politicians love it. They think it gives them more control over the economy. The regulators love it. It gives them power. And often, and this is a problem in South Africa, often it gives them the power to extract bribes. Well, now, if you want approval in 10, 12 years, we'll just go through the regular process. You want approval next week? Well, you know, a little bit of a tip would help. So, regulatory complexity and discretion create the environment for corruption. So, regulation over time, as you can see, there's something of a downward trend. So Robert's warning is appropriate. And then you look at South Africa, way behind Singapore, way behind Rwanda, way behind Botswana. So way behind the two economic success stories in Africa right now, slightly ahead of the world, ahead of the average sub-Saharan Africa, and of course ahead of Zimbabwe. Let's look specifically at regulations. This is out of 10. So the other chart, the longer the thing was, the worse. Here, the longer the column is, the better. So South Africa actually does pretty well on credit regulations. It does poorly on labor regulations and even worse on business regulations. So these are the things we should be looking at today. So again, hours regulation not bad, mandated cost of worker dismissal not bad, but these three are absolutely horrible. It's important to understand how devastating labor regulations are to creating employment and prosperity. People think that if you protect jobs by making firing difficult, that you are protecting jobs. Instead, you're crushing job creation. An employer is not going to hire if that employer cannot adjust their labor force down in a recession. They're just driven into bankruptcy. They're not going to hire if they cannot dismiss somebody who is incompetent or refuses to work. By the way, firing regulations hurt the most vulnerable. You're an employer. The regulations mean you really can't fire somebody. So you don't take risks. A marvelous person who may not have a lot of skills comes to you and you say, gee, I'd love to hire that person. I think there's lots of potential. But if I'm wrong, I can't dismiss them. I'm stuck with them forever. So the unskilled, the people from the lowest level of society, do not get jobs. If you want to open opportunity to all South Africans, from all economic segments, from all races, you need to deal with these perverse regulations. South Africa also has a problem with centralized collective bargaining. If unions hold hostage the big companies or the successful companies, people aren't going to invest anymore. They're going to run down capital. You know, I was talking to somebody in Ireland about 10 years after the Irish introduced their great free market reforms. The person I was talking to, Fred, Ireland before the free market reforms was just an awful place. He said, you couldn't make a profit. Taxes were too high. And we discussed size of government here yesterday. He said, how could you make a profit with taxes like that? And if you somehow managed to make a profit, the unions would come in and demand all the extra money you had and perhaps a little bit more until you were making losses. And then he said to me, and our welfare system was awful. He said, Fred, you wouldn't believe it. There were families with 3 generations without a history of work for a single member of those families, for 3 generations in Cork and in Dublin. He said our social policy was a mess. He said young people would graduate from university and take a taxi directly to the airport to go to New York or to London. He said Ireland was a horrible place. Now, who was giving me that dismal view, particularly of the way labor unions operated? The chief researcher for the largest labor union in Ireland. And the labor unions became part of the solution. They started looking at profits. And this is true of Scandinavian labor unions too, and German labor unions. They started looking at profits not as we got to take all the profits, but as we've got to make sure the companies that our members work for are profitable. So they invest in the future. So they create more jobs. The overly powerful labor unions in South Africa are a real problem for the future economic prosperity of the country. And there are ways to amend labor laws to make labor unions more responsive to real economics and more democratic, so that they aren't the captive of a radical clique at the top of them. Business regulation. Well, again, administrative regulations tie South African firms in knots. Bureaucracy ties them in knots. And bribes and favoritism, because again, the regulations are complex and discretionary, people can demand bribes and favoritism. So these again are challenges that I hope you will help us look at and examine by way of solution. So your task, what needs to be done in South Africa to improve regulations, to unleash the entrepreneurship, drive, and innovation of the South African public. So thank you very, very much.